Okay, check out this title, When Postmodernism Was Rigged Modernism. It's from a pretty explosive piece by Fernando Martínez de Carnero. And when I first read that, I was like, what does that even mean? It sounds kind of like a conspiracy theory, right? But it's actually this really sharp critique of, well, the last 40 years of our culture. So let's get into it. So, the whole thing kicks off with this really provocative question. What if this whole era, our big focus on individuality and being unique, what if that was all just a giant distraction, a cover story to keep us from looking at a much deeper, much more baked-in inequality that never actually went away? Yeah, that's the mystery we're going to dig into. All right, so to really get to the bottom of this, we need to understand the two main suspects here, modernism and postmodernism. And a great way to think about them is like two different operating systems for society. Each one has its own code, its own way of getting us to see the world and our place in it, and what we should even be fighting for. And this is where you really see the clash. Modernism, that was all about the big picture. We're talking society, social class, the collective struggle. Your identity was tied up in your economic role. You were a worker, maybe a union member. You were part of a class fighting for huge systemic change. But then postmodernism comes along and just shatters that. It tells us, hey, forget those big grand stories. Suddenly, the focus shifts to you, the individual. Your identity becomes about your lifestyle, your choices, the stuff you buy. And the goal? It's not about changing the whole system anymore. It's about finding your own personal fulfillment inside of it. So, if this whole postmodernism thing was a rigged game, like the author suggests, how exactly was it set up? Well, he lays out this method for tracing the clues back in time, and he calls it the genealogy of inequality. It's like we're walking through a crime scene. Let's follow the evidence.
Now, this is a really key point. This genealogy of inequality isn't just about saying, hey, look, inequality exists. Nope. It's more like forensics. It's about tracing the very specific moves, the shifts in thinking that allowed us to just stop talking about economic class, even while the gap between the rich and poor was getting wider. It's all about how the subject of conversation itself was changed.
And according to the author, this whole thing happened in a few key steps. First, the very idea of social class gets pushed aside, kind of dismissed as old-fashioned. Then, step two, the entire conversation gets redirected to individual identity and lifestyle. What you buy, what you wear, your personal brand. And while everyone's busy focusing on themselves, what happens? The massive economic power structures are left completely unchallenged. Nobody's even looking at them. And the end result? Well, inequality gets a whole lot worse. But now, it's spun as a result of your personal choices, not a broken system.
And this quote from the source just, wow, it absolutely nails it. Style became the chisel. Think about that. Instead of using the big tools of economics and politics to build a more equal society, we were handed this little chisel of personal style to carve out a unique identity for ourselves. Our identities became symbolic, a performance, and in the middle of all that raw, real tension between the haves and the have-nots, it just kind of faded away.
This picture right here is a perfect snapshot of that older, modernist way of thinking. Just look at the demands on this banner. They're not subtle. Work, health, housing, salary, security, education. These aren't about individual expression or finding yourself. No way. These are huge, collective, structural demands. This is the exact conversation that, according to the author, got swapped out for the focus on the individual.
Okay, so the game was rigged, the conversation was changed, and these deep structural inequalities were basically hidden in plain sight. But then, something happened. A global event that absolutely no one could ignore, an event that, the author argues, yanked back the curtain on the entire performance, the COVID-19 pandemic. And what a brutal, clarifying moment it was. That whole carefully built facade of individualism, the idea that we're all just these free agents making our own way in the world, it was suddenly and just violently stripped away. Your personal brand didn't mean a thing when a virus was sweeping the globe. And the reality that was hiding underneath that facade, it was stark. All of a sudden, it was impossible to ignore who could work safely from home and who had to risk their lives every single day on the front lines. It laid bare the massive gaps in healthcare access. It showed us exactly where economic insecurity was concentrated. And that term, essential worker, in a lot of ways, it just became a new name for the working class. The pandemic basically proved that your health, your safety, your economic survival, these weren't just matters of personal choice. They were deeply, deeply tied to those old, supposedly outdated modernist structures of class and economic power that we were all told to forget about.
So, after following all the clues, what's the final verdict on this whole rigged game? And maybe more importantly,
where does all of this leave us now?
Well, the author's conclusion is pretty powerful. The big shift to postmodernism wasn't some kind of grand revolution that set us all free. According to this analysis, it was a lot more like a corporate rebranding. Think of it like a new marketing campaign that kept the same old unequal product on the shelves, but just slapped a shiny new label on it that said individuality and choice. The fundamental inequalities of the old economic system? They never went anywhere. They just got a whole lot better at camouflage.
And that brings us to the final and maybe most important question. The pandemic exposed the cracks in our old story. It showed us what was being hidden. So if that story is broken, if it no longer works, what comes next? As we try to write a new chapter, one that actually faces the reality the pandemic laid bare, what should that new story even be about? That's the challenge this whole analysis leaves us with.